as always. And yes, Jason, I know what I'm getting into every time by now, so.
I mean, before we even started the show, you walked into this conversation Toussaint and I were having. It's like, whoa. Oh, the ukulele ate. Toussaint, I think you have the biggest question for Brother Prescod.
All right. I think what people all want to know is, Paul, why do you hate all of the sacred cows? Why do you hate Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power movement in this new article?
I remember last time, not the last time I came on, but it was like, why do you hate Marcus Garvey? And then it was like, why do you hate the March on Washington? Which I know. Yeah, I mean, I can start. One thing I'll say, I mean, just generally, you know, I in the piece I talk about Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton. They wrote Black Power in 1967, which was kind of the first articulation of like what Black Power could mean. It was also, I think, the first articulation of institutional racism. So just on a general note, even though, you know, people won't be surprised that I and people like Jason and others have a lot of disagreements with the people of that era advocating Black Power, I will say, compared to people today, like Ibram X. Kendi, you know, their work was far more sophisticated and grounded in a good material analysis. So, you know, and I think that when this concept of institutional racism came on the scene, I mean, I think it was motivated by a good impulse, and it was starting to get at something genuine, which was how do we analyze racism and racial inequality that goes beyond individual racism, cultural beliefs, prejudice behavior. So that was a motivation of that. And, you know, it was this idea of like, you know, we passed the Civil Rights Act in 64, we passed the Voting Rights Act in 65, yet conditions of Black people are not only not getting better, but they're getting worse and worse and worse. So I think in that sense, the framework, I think, started from a healthy impulse. And, you know, when I kind of came across the term, you know, roughly 15 years ago when I kind of started being a part of the left, you know, I was kind of searching for a way to, how can we think about racism as Marxism, not just be about don't be racist as an individual. And I was drawn to this term, but I think over time I kind of found there was a lack of clarity of what it really meant. And it's really become something that I think people just throw out there. It really makes you sound smart. I mean, it just does. Every time you say it, you feel good about yourself.
An angel gets its wings.
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, I think it's become something that's kind of gotten away from actually thinking about institutions. And, you know, now it's really common. I mean, even in pop culture, I mean, you listen to like a Black talk radio show or like a major, you know, station, anyone with a podcast, they'll throw this term out. So now I think it's pretty widely used, but it's become kind of a little bit meaningless. And I think now it's just kind of a way to say racial disparities, and it doesn't really illuminate much about what is causing these racial disparities. So that's why these sacred cows got to go, you know?
I mean, before we move on from that, I do think that's kind of an important point to talk about here. And I'm glad Toussaint wanted to open up with that, because when you write these articles, you're tackling things that I think people don't even really think about anymore, because they've almost become sacrosanct in certain aspects of the Black community, and definitely in certain aspects of African-American academia. Talking about the nuances of, now I can't even think of his name. Who was the first Black man we pissed off? When
Marcus
Paul came out?
Garvey.
Marcus Garvey. There you go. That guy. The crypto salesman. The crypto
Mm-hmm.
salesman. You know, we joke about it, but
I mean,
but it's beyond just, you know, the selling of these boats that, you know, weren't seaworthy. It is kind of, I believe he's a true believer to a certain extent. I don't think he's just a dirty snake oil salesman. What is your opinion of, let's call him Kwame Ture?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was also a true believer. And one thing that's kind of interesting, I actually suggest people read his autobiography, Ready for Revolution. I believe it's written in the 90s. It's actually a lot better than I thought it was, thought it would be, and had a better kind of a class analysis generally than I thought it would. There's a lot of things I disagree with. And what I actually found is that the closer he was grounded to a movement that was tethered to a specific place and specific goals. So specifically his work with SNCC in the South, I think the Lowndes County Democratic Party or Freedom Democratic Party, I forget the exact name. His analysis during that period when he was working in that capacity, I think made a lot more sense. It was a lot more interesting. The more he kind of became, which he eventually kind of did in the late 60s, this kind of jet-setting international leftist star kind of went from place to place, giving lectures, giving, he became known for inflammatory speeches and, advocating rioting, blah, blah, blah. And, he was concerned about the war in Vietnam, which of course isn't a bad thing. But once he kind of became that person of, I'm just going to kind of travel around to conferences and give radical speeches, he went to various nations in Africa and was kind of, I wouldn't say working with, but maybe attached to anti-colonial movements, the more the analysis to me kind of just lost its grounding in reality. But again, I think it's a book is interesting and good to read, his autobiography. But yeah, I mean, I would say he was a true believer. And again, I think the book Black Power in 1967 has like tons of weaknesses, but I think in terms of describing the problem, it hit the mark in many ways. And again, I know I say this probably every single time in the show and people are tired of me hearing this, but it is interesting that he and people like Rustin and Randolph, they really actually came to a similar diagnosis, similar conclusion in the mid 60s that the civil rights legislation is not actually improving material realities for Black people, especially Black people in the North. If anything, things are getting worse. They actually both really agreed on that point. Then the question is what comes next. And I think the big weakness in Black Power as a book, again, the first half is not terrible. They have good insights. They're describing racial inequality. They're talking about how this is working on a systemic framework and not individuals. But the problem really becomes when they turn to solutions. And it's really underwhelming. And I kind of go into it in a piece. I mean, they talk about, well, first we need to reclaim racial pride, cultural pride, community control of especially schools. That was a kind of big push in the mid and late 60s. And again, I mean, I think, especially from our standpoint, it's easy to say, well, that's a bad idea. I think it made sense at the time, and there's nothing wrong with, okay, there's a predominantly Black school district, Black parents should have more control. But again, it misses the real institutional mechanism. I mean, take where I am in Philadelphia. I mean, our funding for a school district is predominantly at the state and federal level. And that's where, and the big issue is, I mean, we, in Pennsylvania, we don't even tax our natural gas companies in the state. And we're a huge fracking state, University of Pennsylvania, which has an endowment with 20-something billion dollars. They don't pay property taxes at all. They don't do pilots or anything. So those would be the institutional mechanisms to fund the school district of Philadelphia more, that kind of tax policy at the state and federal level. So, they talk about community control of institutions. They have a lot of vague thoughts about Black political power. And again, I mean, I think we can be charitable and sympathetic. Like in 1967, this is the very beginning of the wave of Black political power. So there's vague thoughts about that, and they kind of have a inadequate explanation of how that would be different than regular electoral politics. They say stuff like, well, they'll be controlled by the people. They'll be coming out of people power. Okay. So yeah, that's where the book becomes very underwhelming. And I think that's where the flaw of structural racism, institutional racism is because I think it's describing disparities and inequality that are real. Again, you just look at the numbers, you can't really deny a lot of these disparities, but it's misdiagnosing the cause. Because if you're looking at what is showing up as a racial disparity, it may not be caused by race necessarily. You know, if it's caused by automation and it's caused by jobs fleeing to the suburbs and fleeing overseas, you know, that's not necessarily a singular racial issue. But if you're diagnosing it as a racial issue, I think like the policy proposals are going to be underwhelming. And I think especially nowadays, they just turn into like kind of neoliberal solutions. And even though people want to say structural over and over again, they're actually not getting at the institutional dynamic.